On New Year's Eve, my parents shut down my proposal in front of everyone, saying, "You don't deserve to carry the family name." The room went silent, my fiancé froze, and I felt my entire life crack in half. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Ria. I had waited for that night with hope in my chest. Evan had planned everything quietly, just how I liked it. When the countdown ended and fireworks filled the sky, he reached for my hand. Before he could speak, my father stood up. His voice was calm, sharp, and cold. My mother nodded beside him, as if this had been planned for weeks. They said Evan was not good enough. They said I had embarrassed them. They said love was not enough to earn respect. Every word felt heavy. Guests avoided my eyes. Evan looked hurt but stayed still, giving me strength without saying a word. That night, I understood something I had ignored for years. I had always worked hard to please them. I followed rules, stayed quiet, and earned my place. Still, it was never enough. Their love had conditions. The next morning, they asked me to fix things. They wanted me to delay the engagement and apologize. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply said no. I packed my things and left with Evan. Life after that was not easy, but it was honest. We built a small, steady life with respect and peace. Months later, my parents tried to return, speaking softly, asking for forgiveness. By then, I had learned my worth. I didn't need their name to stand tall. I had my own. I always believed my household stood for loyalty, fairness, and quiet pride. Growing up, I trusted that love was solid, not fragile. I thought guidance meant protection and that expectations came from care. For years, I shaped myself to fit what I believed mattered most to them. I was the child who listened. I planned ahead. I stayed late at part-time jobs while studying, saving every dollar, never asking for help. I skipped trips, ignored comfort, and chose responsibility each time. I believed effort would earn belonging. I believed sacrifice would be seen. Family dinners felt formal but safe. Advice was firm yet framed as concern. When mistakes happened, I corrected them quickly. I thought maturity meant silence. I thought strength meant endurance. Praise was rare, but I told myself it wasn't needed. I assumed respect existed even when it wasn't spoken. I carried the belief that reputation mattered more than emotion. I accepted that affection was subtle, not expressive. When relatives spoke about tradition, I listened carefully, convinced I was part of something lasting. I never imagined approval could vanish in a moment. I trusted that standing beside them for years meant something permanent. I trusted that shared history could not be erased by one decision. I trusted that being dependable counted for more than image. That belief shaped how I lived. It shaped how I loved. It shaped what I tolerated. I defended them when others questioned their coldness. I told friends they showed care in different ways. I protected their image even when it cost me comfort. What I didn't see was how conditional everything was. I didn't realize that acceptance depended on obedience. I didn't understand that respect could be withdrawn without warning. That night did not just shock me. It rewrote my past. It forced me to see that the foundation I stood on was never as strong as I believed. The plan was simple and private. Evan wanted a soft moment, nothing loud or flashy. He knew I preferred calm over attention. He waited until the celebration slowed, when laughter settled and the music faded into the background. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for mine, not from doubt, but from care. The room glowed with glass reflections and soft gold light. Conversations blended into a low hum. I felt safe for a brief second, unaware of what was about to break through that peace. Evan drew a breath, ready to speak, ready to change our lives with a few honest words. That moment never arrived. Before he could begin, my parents stepped forward. Their timing was sharp, deliberate. What should have been a shared promise became a performance I never agreed to. Attention shifted instantly. Faces turned. Smiles faded. The warmth drained from the room. My father spoke first, his tone polished and firm. My mother followed, reinforcing every sentence with quiet approval. Their voices carried authority, cutting through the air like glass. Celebration turned into inspection. Love turned into evaluation. I stood frozen. Evan straightened beside me, confused but composed. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He waited, respecting a space that had already been stolen from him. What hurt most was not the interruption, but the intent. This was not impulsive. It felt prepared. The timing was too precise, the words too confident. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted control. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one laughed. Glasses remained raised but untouched. The joy that once filled the space vanished, replaced by tension and disbelief. I realized then that this was never about the proposal itself. It was about stopping it. They didn't just refuse to celebrate. They chose to dominate the moment, reshaping something tender into something sharp. That night, what should have been a beginning became a dividing line I could never step back across. My father spoke first. His voice carried weight, not volume. He looked at me as if measuring something that no longer held value. He said my place was not lasting, that I existed on borrowed time. The meaning landed harder than the sentence itself. It stripped me of permanence, as if I could be erased without consequence. Then my mother added her judgment. Her tone was calm, almost practiced. She labeled what I shared with Evan as an error, something careless, something bound to fail. There was no hesitation in her delivery. No softness. Just certainty. Hearing that word from her hurt more than anger ever could. They went further without raising their voices. They spoke about heritage, legacy, and continuation, framing identity as something inherited rather than earned. It became clear they believed value traveled through lineage, not effort. Personal growth meant nothing to them. Integrity meant nothing. Only origin mattered. I felt reduced to a symbol instead of a person. Everything I had built on my own was dismissed in seconds. Achievements, discipline, and commitment were ignored. I was judged not by who I stood beside, but by whether he fit their standard. What stunned me most was how easily they spoke. There was no sign of conflict in their expressions. No struggle. These thoughts had lived inside them for a long time. They were simply waiting for the right moment to release them. I wanted to respond, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My throat tightened. My hands stayed still. I realized they were not trying to protect me. They were protecting an image they valued more than my happiness. That exchange changed something deep inside me. Respect dissolved. Trust collapsed. I understood that love, in their world, required permission and proof. Without approval, I was disposable. Those words didn't just hurt. They clarified everything. In that moment, I saw exactly where I stood, and how far I needed to move away. What followed was worse than the remarks themselves. The space filled with stillness, thick and heavy. People who had known me my whole life looked away. Chairs shifted. Breaths were held. No one stepped forward. No one interrupted. The absence of support pressed harder than any accusation. My Aunt Sloane kept her eyes fixed on the table, tracing the rim of her glass as if it held answers. She had always spoken about unity, about standing together, yet she stayed motionless. Her quiet felt deliberate, like a choice made long before that evening. Across the room, Perrin adjusted his jacket and offered a weak smile to no one in particular. He avoided my gaze completely. We grew up side by side, shared holidays, secrets, and late-night talks. In that instant, distance replaced familiarity. His stillness felt like agreement. I searched faces, hoping for a single sign of resistance. There was none. Each person remained anchored to comfort, unwilling to risk disapproval. Their quiet formed a wall, separating me from everything I once considered safe. Beside me, Evan absorbed it all without speaking. His shoulders stiffened. His expression changed, not with anger, but with understanding. I could see the realization settle in him, the awareness that he was unwanted, judged, and dismissed without a fair chance. The place he imagined entering no longer existed. He didn't lower his head. He didn't react. That restraint made the moment heavier. He stood exposed, surrounded by people who had already decided his worth without knowing him. I wanted to reach for him, to say something, anything. Instead, I stood frozen, watching the truth unfold. It wasn't just rejection. It was collective approval through inaction. That quiet confirmed what words had already suggested. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was shared belief. And in that stillness, I understood I was alone, not because I lacked allies, but because no one chose to be one. They believed dependence defined me. They assumed comfort came from their reach, that security flowed only through their approval. What they never noticed was how much I handled on my own, far from their view. While expectations surrounded me, I learned self-reliance in silence. I chose paths that required effort instead of shortcuts. Long hours became routine. Early mornings, late nights, and constant pressure shaped my days. I didn't announce progress. I didn't seek praise. I moved forward quietly. Every obligation tied to my name became my responsibility alone. I tracked expenses carefully, made steady payments, and closed accounts one by one. Each cleared balance felt like relief, not pride. Freedom mattered more than recognition. I wanted stability without strings attached. Professionally, I built something steady through patience and consistency. No favors. No introductions. No inherited leverage. Just earned trust and measured growth. I learned to negotiate, to plan, to recover from mistakes without asking for rescue. That independence strengthened me in ways they never anticipated. They continued seeing me as someone sheltered, someone who would return when challenged. They underestimated how capable I had become without their involvement. Their assumptions rested on an outdated version of me that no longer existed. What they failed to understand was that distance had already formed long before that night. Emotional separation began years earlier, shaped by self-discipline and quiet determination. I had learned to stand without leaning on their influence. The identity they tried to strip away wasn't theirs to control. I had already rewritten it through effort and resolve. Their approval no longer defined my survival. Their rejection no longer threatened my foundation. By the time they spoke with certainty about my future, I had already secured it. Their words landed too late to weaken me. I wasn't bound by expectation or obligation anymore. Morning light exposed everything the night had hidden. Voices sounded firmer, expressions controlled, as if the previous event had been a planned correction rather than a wound. They spoke with authority, outlining expectations like terms in a contract. Their condition was simple: submission first, belonging later. They insisted I acknowledge fault in front of the same people who watched me be diminished. They wanted delay, distance, and obedience disguised as reflection. Their language suggested generosity, as though compliance would be a privilege granted, not a cost demanded. They framed it as unity, but it felt like erasure. I listened without interruption. My heartbeat stayed steady. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger rising. It was clarity forming. The request revealed more than their earlier statements ever could. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were enforcing control. I realized they expected fear. They expected negotiation. They expected me to bend quietly and accept the narrative they designed. What they didn't expect was resolve. For years, I absorbed pressure, believing patience would preserve connection. That morning, patience expired. The suggestion that my future required permission crossed a boundary I didn't know existed until it was violated. I understood then that acceptance came at the price of self-erasure. They wanted silence, delay, and compliance, not understanding. They wanted proof of loyalty through surrender. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't justify anything. I simply refused. The decision felt sudden, but it had been forming long before that moment. Their demand completed the picture. What broke wasn't my attachment. It was my hesitation. I stopped hoping for fairness. I stopped expecting change. I chose myself without explanation. That morning didn't end with reconciliation. It ended with separation. A quiet one. A final one. I walked away without apology, not because I lacked regret, but because I finally understood my worth wasn't negotiable. I chose restraint instead of reaction. There was no argument, no dramatic pause meant to change minds. I made my choice quietly, the way I had learned to do many difficult things. Their conditions no longer required consideration. I placed the ring on the table between us. It had been discussed for years, treated like a symbol of approval rather than connection. I slid it forward without hesitation. The object carried no weight for me anymore. Whatever meaning it once held had dissolved. They seemed surprised by the lack of resistance. I offered no explanation, no defense, no emotional appeal. I didn't ask to be understood. I didn't ask to be reconsidered. I simply acted. My movements were steady. Hands relaxed. Breath even. I gathered what belonged to me and left everything else untouched. Nothing needed to be reclaimed. Nothing needed to be proven. The decision spoke clearly on its own. No raised voices followed me. No footsteps rushed after me. The quiet stayed behind, wrapped around them instead. I walked through the doorway feeling lighter than expected, not relieved, but resolved. Outside, the air felt different. Not warmer. Not colder. Just open. I stood still for a moment, letting the shift settle. There was no rush to replace what I had stepped away from. Loss didn't arrive all at once. It arrived as space. I didn't look back. Not out of pride, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. What mattered had already been decided. That departure marked an ending without spectacle. No witness. No confrontation. Just certainty. I didn't leave because I was pushed out. I left because staying required shrinking. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was guided by self-respect. I didn't need closure from them. I created it myself with one simple act. That moment didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment. For the first time, my actions matched my truth. And that quiet alignment was stronger than any argument I could have made. Time moved forward without permission. Days stacked into weeks, then stretched into seasons. Distance settled naturally, not forced, not announced. Life continued, shaped by intention rather than expectation. Evan and I focused on what felt steady. We chose simplicity. Plans were modest, guided by comfort instead of display. Decisions came easily because they were ours alone. There was no audience to impress, no approval to chase. Each choice reflected mutual respect and shared direction. Our home became a place of balance. Routine replaced tension. Conversations felt open, unguarded. Laughter returned without effort. We learned each other's rhythms, supported quiet ambitions, and handled challenges together without interference. Stability grew through consistency, not control. I noticed changes in myself. Sleep came easier. Doubt softened. I stopped bracing for criticism that never arrived. Confidence strengthened through peace, not resistance. I no longer measured success by reaction. I measured it by calm. Occasionally, fragments of news reached me through indirect channels. Authority they once held weakened. Influence slipped quietly. Decisions that used to command agreement met hesitation. The certainty they relied on no longer carried the same weight. Regret surfaced without confrontation. It appeared in delayed messages, softened tones, and attempts at relevance. There were no direct admissions, only subtle signs of loss. The distance they once enforced now worked against them. I observed without satisfaction or bitterness. Their struggle didn't bring joy. It simply confirmed reality. Control fades when it's no longer feared. Power dissolves when it's no longer obeyed. Meanwhile, my life expanded gently. Purpose felt internal. Happiness arrived without announcement. I didn't need reconciliation to feel complete. I didn't need acknowledgement to feel validated. What I built wasn't dramatic. It was durable. It didn't rely on permission or inheritance. It stood on trust, effort, and choice. That foundation held firm because it was honest. Months didn't heal everything, but they clarified what mattered. I didn't replace what I lost. I outgrew it. And in that growth, I found something quieter than triumph, peace that didn't depend on anyone else. Months later, a situation arose that shifted everything. My father's company faced unexpected challenges, and suddenly, they sought what they had long assumed I would offer freely: intervention. My mother contacted me carefully, her voice smooth, as if concern could mask past behavior. I listened politely, pretending uncertainty, while quietly weighing their request. They assumed urgency would weaken my resolve, that old patterns of obedience would return. They didn't know I had spent the last months learning to navigate life independently, solving problems without depending on anyone else. They wanted guidance, advice, or resources, thinking I would bend. I recognized the confidence in their tone, a subtle expectation that I would comply. They underestimated how much distance had changed the balance. Instead of rushing, I responded with calm precision. I set conditions, not out of spite, but to establish clarity. For the first time, they realized that I was not bound by expectation or fear. The daughter they dismissed as compliant had become careful, deliberate, and unshakable. Their faces betrayed subtle shock. The certainty they carried for years, the belief that control was effortless, cracked under quiet firmness. They tried to mask it, but I saw hesitation where they expected compliance. I offered help, but only on terms that respected my boundaries and independence. The realization hit them slowly: influence was no longer guaranteed. Requests were no longer demands, and respect was no longer automatic. That day, the dynamics shifted. They confronted the truth they had ignored for years. Their assumptions about dependency, loyalty, and power had been flawed. I didn't gloat. I simply acted with intention. The tables turned not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to return to a place I had already outgrown. Their recognition came too late to matter, except as a quiet confirmation of how far I had come. When they reached out again, I maintained composure. There was no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just measured responses and clear boundaries. I listened to their proposals, their hints of reconciliation, but I weighed every word against the respect I had lost long ago. I declined any offer of aid, careful not to insult yet unwavering indecision. Politeness framed my refusal, but firmness underscored it. I made it clear that support would not be accepted under the pretense of familial obligation. I reminded them gently that the past could not be erased by sudden concern. The family name they prized so highly had never guaranteed trust or loyalty, and I would not let it dictate my choices now. Their expectations were no longer my responsibility. Each word I spoke carried quiet authority. I didn't need to shout or accuse. I didn't need to explain every decision. The act of refusing became its own statement, signaling independence, clarity, and a refusal to be manipulated. I observed the subtle shift in their demeanor. Shock, hesitation, and an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. They realized the daughter they had dismissed and tried to control had become unmovable, capable of walking away without resentment, guided by reason rather than reaction. It was a calculated, silent revenge. Not explosive, not vengeful in a way that would cause chaos. Instead, it was a demonstration of strength through self-possession. The message was clear: respect must be earned, not assumed, and control would no longer be taken for granted. That calm defiance reshaped the balance. I reclaimed power quietly, without spectacle, leaving them to confront the consequences of underestimating me. My independence became the ultimate statement, far louder than any argument could ever have been. It wasn't immediate. Weeks turned into months before they spoke again, their voices softer, cautious, as if testing the waters of a bridge they had burned. They framed their words carefully, avoiding blame, attempting to restore a connection they had long neglected. They expressed regret, offering phrases that sounded rehearsed, acknowledgement of mistakes, admissions of misjudgment, and hints of remorse. But the tone lacked urgency or true vulnerability. Their apology arrived not from insight, but from circumstance, after setbacks exposed the limits of their control. Business troubles had chipped their authority. Friends and colleagues had noticed shifts in influence. Their image, once polished, now bore subtle cracks. And in that moment, they realized that the person they had tried to dictate and diminish was no longer dependent or pliable. I listened without interruption, my expression neutral. Their words carried weight only because I allowed it. I had already taken steps that removed the leverage they once held over me. Their attempts at reconciliation collided with a reality they hadn't anticipated. I had built stability, security, and respect on my own terms. It became clear that their apology was too late to matter. Access to the daughter they once controlled was no longer negotiable. Attempts to regain influence felt hollow, echoing the emptiness of lost opportunities. The bridge they hoped to rebuild had been crossed without them. I didn't reject their words outright. I simply acknowledged them internally, knowing their timing rendered them symbolic rather than transformative. The power balance had shifted permanently. By the time they tried to make amends, the consequences of their past arrogance had already taken root. They had lost control, reputation, and access to the life they once thought they dictated. And I, unshaken, stood beyond the reach of their regret. The day of our wedding was calm, intimate, and full of warmth. Faces around us reflected genuine happiness, unshadowed by judgment or expectation. There were no reminders of past disapproval, no whispers of legacy or status, only celebration of the bond we had built together. Evan held my hand firmly, his smile steady, his presence a reminder that loyalty and love were earned, not inherited. Every vow spoken felt deliberate, grounded in trust and shared history, untainted by the ghosts of family pressures. I noticed the difference immediately. Laughter was natural, conversations flowed easily, and eyes met mine without calculation. It was the contrast of everything I had endured, a life previously measured against impossible standards, now replaced by authenticity. News of the wedding reached my parents indirectly. Their absence was telling. No interference, no grand gestures, no attempt to reclaim authority. They watched from the distance they had chosen, finally confronted with the reality they could no longer influence. In that quiet, I understood something profound: revenge need not be loud or vengeful. It could be achieved through resilience, self-respect, and independence. By creating a life free from their control, by living fully on my own terms, I had already claimed the victory they could never anticipate. The truth settled in me like a calm tide: being untouchable was stronger than anger, fiercer than retaliation. It was the result of choices made carefully, patience cultivated, and boundaries firmly held. I looked around at friends, family, and loved ones who valued me for who I was, not what I carried. Their presence was affirmation enough. Walking down the aisle, hand in hand with Evan, I felt complete, not through approval, but through certainty. The ending they tried to script had failed, and in its place, I had written a story of freedom, love, and quiet triumph. Do you think I did the right thing by walking away, or should I have given them another chance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this.